picture this. You're this massive crowd, like it seems to go on forever. August 28th, 1963, the March on Washington. You know the moment, right? Yeah. Martin Luther King Jr. is about to give his I Have a Dream speech. One of those moments that just gets burned into history. But just behind him, you might not even notice him in the photos, but there's this man, Bayard Rustin, and he's the one who helped make it all happen.
Yeah, you don't hear enough about Rustin. He wasn't just some guy organizing things. This guy, he was a brilliant strategist. He was like King's right-hand man.
Yeah.
And he just never stopped fighting for what he believed in.
And in this deep dive, we're going to really get into his story. It's fascinating, full of twists and turns. Here's a guy, a gay black man, in a time when that was, well, really tough. He was even a communist for a bit, then became a pacifist. And he was always working behind the scenes to push the civil rights movement forward.
It really makes you think, about how we tell history, who we remember and who we kind of forget, even when they were so important.
So let's start at the beginning. Rustin was raised by his Quaker grandparents in Pennsylvania. And it seems like that upbringing, it really instilled in him this deep sense of fighting for what's right, for social justice.
Oh, yeah. His grandmother, Julia Davis Rustin, she was a force, a member of the NAACP. Their house was a meeting place for some really big names in the black community, like W.E.B. Du Bois even would come by. So yeah, young Bayard, he was surrounded by that kind of thinking from the start.
Then he heads to New York City in the 1930s. It was such a vibrant time for culture, and, it offered a bit more safety for a gay man compared to other places. And get this, he even spent some time performing on Broadway. A singer, a performer, who knew?
Right, talented guy. But it was really the Depression and the labor movement gaining steam. That's what really got him going with activism.
He actually joined the Communist Party for a while, right? Mm-hmm. Picked up some valuable organizing skills there, though he eventually split ways with them. Different ideas, I guess.
Yeah, he was always thinking for himself, challenging the way things were. You see that throughout his life. Like, he took what he learned from the communists about economic justice, but then went his own way.
And that leads us to his big moment with Gandhian philosophy. He really dove into Gandhi's teachings on nonviolent resistance, even traveled to India after Gandhi died to study the movement up close.
Totally changed him. See, Gandhi's ideas, they fit right in with Rustin's Quaker upbringing, that whole belief that every single person matters, and that mix of influences, it became like the foundation of how he approached activism, and it really shaped the whole civil rights movement.
And then, this is where it gets really interesting. During the Montgomery bus boycott, he meets Martin Luther King Jr. They become close, with Rustin acting as a mentor to King.
Oh, yeah, that was huge. Rustin's the one who really introduced King to all the nuances of Gandhi's philosophy, helped him refine his strategy for nonviolent resistance, and that had a big impact on how King became the leader he was. Hard to imagine the movement without that connection, really.
But, and there's always a but, their relationship was complicated. Back then, being gay was, well, society just wasn't ready for it. They even had to split up for a while because people were putting pressure on King, saying Rustin's sexuality would hurt the movement.
Yeah, sad but true. Even within a movement fighting for equality, prejudice was holding them back. They had this deep respect for each other, shared goals, but they had to walk on eggshells because of what people might say.
Now, we can't talk about Bayard Rustin without talking about the March on Washington, one of the most important moments in American history. But it actually started with A. Philip Randolph, the labor leader, a close friend of Rustin.
Randolph had been pushing for a March on Washington for years, He wanted to force the government to deal with racial discrimination when it came to jobs. But it was the civil rights movement really picking up steam in the early 60s that made it the perfect time.
And who better to pull it off than Bayard Rustin? He basically became the architect of the whole thing, all the logistics, coordinating different groups, keeping that message of nonviolence front and center.
Oh, man, a huge job. And that's where you see Rustin's genius. He managed to bring together all these different groups, civil rights activists, labor unions, religious organizations, all united for jobs and freedom.
Right, and it wasn't just about ending segregation in the South. The March on Washington was about economic justice for everyone, no matter their race. It was about the right to a decent job, a fair wage, Those things were all tied together with racial equality in Rustin's mind. That's a key part of his vision, something we'll keep digging into as we go.
And it's something that still matters today, right? We're still grappling with racial and economic inequality. But before we get into the impact of the march and what it all meant, We should talk about the challenges Rustin faced in pulling it off. I mean, it was a huge undertaking. Organizing a march with 250,000 people showing up in Washington, D.C., that's a logistical nightmare.
I bet. Transportation, food, security, getting the message out, you have to plan for everything. It blows my mind how they did it.
Yeah, and the stories about just how big it all was are pretty amazing. Like Michelle Horowitz, the one handling transportation, she thought they'd be short on people at first because she only counted on buses and trains. Totally forgot folks would drive themselves.
Wow, that shows you how much people wanted to be there.
Yeah.
It really was a grassroots thing. They were determined to make it happen.
For sure. And then on top of all that, there was the political side of things. J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, he was trying to stop the whole march. Saw Rustin as a way to make the movement look bad. Gay guy, former communist.
It's crazy the government working against them like that. Hoover even called Rustin a communist homosexual, tried to use his past arrests, from activism and being gay, to paint the whole movement as dangerous.
Exactly, and it gets worse. Strom Thurmond, that senator from South Carolina, the one who was all about segregation, he went after Rustin on the Senate floor, called him a pervert, a draft dodger. Just awful stuff.
It's hard to believe they said those things right.
Yeah.
In Congress. Sounds like they were using Rustin to try to discredit the whole march.
That's it. They wanted to scare people and break them apart. But thankfully, A. Philip Randolph, he stood by Rustin. He wouldn't let prejudice stop them. Had a whole press conference, said he supported Rustin, talked about how important he was to the march, wouldn't give in to that hate.
That's what you call standing up for what's right. Especially back then when it was so risky. Shows what kind of guy Randolph was.
It was a huge moment for Rustin. People finally recognizing his work despite all the bigotry. And after all that, the march, it was a huge success. Over 250,000 people in Washington demanding jobs and freedom. Can you imagine the energy, the emotion that day?
I got chills just thinking about it. Being in that crowd, hearing King give that speech, I have a dream, and Rustin right there with him. Unbelievable.
It really shows you what people can do when they come together, Fighting for what's right, nothing can stop them. But Rustin's story, it doesn't end there. He kept fighting for equality and economic justice for years, even when it meant disagreeing with some of his old friends.
That's what makes him so interesting, Ron. He was complicated, didn't fit in any one box, a genius behind the scenes, and someone with a real vision. He saw how racial and economic justice were connected way before most people did.
Jobs and freedom, that was his message, and he really lived it. Believed that everyone deserved a chance to succeed, a good life, and he never stopped working for that.
So what happened after the march? Things changed for him. Did he finally get the credit he deserved?
In some ways, yeah. The March on Washington, it put him in the spotlight. He was even on the cover of Life magazine with Randolph. But the prejudice, the homophobia, it didn't just go away.
I figured sad, but not surprising, I guess. He always had to prove himself because of who he was.
You got it. But Rustin didn't let that stop him. He just kept going, found new ways to make a difference, started the A. Philip Randolph Institute, a group focused on helping Black communities. Makes sense. He always believed that racial equality couldn't happen without economic power. For him, civil rights and labor rights, economic justice, they were all connected.
That's something we don't talk about enough, even now. We focus on the laws and social stuff, but economic inequality, that's a big part of the problem.
Absolutely. Rustin saw that way back then. He saw how racism played out in jobs, housing, education, and that's what he fought against.
He was way ahead of his time in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But I also heard he had some disagreements with people in the movement later on.
That's right. Things were changing in the late 60s, early 70s. And Rustin, he didn't always see eye to eye with some folks on things like Vietnam and affirmative action.
Yeah, those were tough issues, especially for someone with his background.
He was raised a pacifist, so the war in Vietnam, that was a big conflict. Even within the civil rights movement, he just couldn't support violence, even for a good cause. And with affirmative action, he thought it would cause more problems than it solved. Believed that helping everyone get ahead, no matter their race, that was the better way to fight racism.
Those are some tough topics, even now. Makes you think about how to make change happen, all the different ways to go about it.
Right. Rustin wasn't afraid to speak his mind, even if it made people mad. He wanted to have those hard conversations, question everything, even when it meant disagreeing with friends.
Sounds like he always wanted to find the best way to make real, lasting change, even if it wasn't popular.
That's what I admire about him. He was an idealist, but he was also practical. He understood how power works, how to make things happen. He could compromise when he needed to, but he never gave up on his beliefs.
A real balancing act, staying true to yourself while working within the system. So where does Bayard Rustin fit in the story of the civil rights movement? How should we remember him? That's what we'll talk about in the last part of our deep dive.
It's strange, isn't it? A guy who did so much and he's almost forgotten.
I know, right? Makes you wonder how we decide who gets remembered. It's like the leaders, the ones out front, they get all the attention. The people behind the scenes, the organizers, the strategists, they kind of disappear.
And in Rustin's case, there's the whole thing with him being gay. Like we talked about, society just wasn't ready for that. It's kind of sad how prejudice can change history, make people invisible.
Yeah, it makes you think we need to keep looking back, you know, digging deeper, finding those stories that got buried. So where does Bayard Rustin fit in when we talk about the civil rights movement?
That's a tough one. Historians are still arguing about it. He was definitely one of the smartest guys in the movement, like shaping King's whole nonviolence thing, planning the March on Washington. That march changed everything. But you don't hear his name as much as King or Malcolm X.
It doesn't make sense. He was right there with the leaders, shaping what they did, but then he's also in the background, hidden because of who he was.
Yeah, it's complicated, full of contradictions, you know. And that's what makes him so interesting to study. He makes us look past the easy stories and see how messy history really is.
He was a socialist, but he didn't agree with every socialist idea. A pacifist, but he had to deal with war. A gay man fighting for justice when people were against him for being gay.
He had strong beliefs, that's for sure. Always questioned the way things were, even if it meant losing friends. Like his views on Vietnam, on affirmative action, some people hated those. But it shows he was thinking for himself, having those tough conversations.
He seemed like he was always trying to find the best way to make things better, even if it made him unpopular.
Exactly. He didn't care about being on the right side or having the perfect answer. He wanted to get things done, and he knew that meant working with what you got, changing things up when you needed to. He never lost sight of his goals, though.
He was good at finding that middle ground where your ideals meet the real world. So what do you think? What's Rustin's biggest contribution? How should we remember him?
For me, it's how he saw that everything was connected, all this social justice stuff. Racial equality, economic justice, labor rights, peace. He knew you couldn't fight for one without the others. Real equality meant fixing the whole system, not just parts of it.
And he gave his whole life to that, even when people pushed him away.
He was brave, strong, and he showed that one person can make a difference, even when it seems impossible.
So what's the one thing you hope people take away from this? What do you want our listeners to remember about Bayard Rustin?
I hope they're inspired by him, by how much he cared about justice, how smart he was, how he never backed down. But I also hope it makes them want to dig deeper, learn more, question what they've been told, because history is never simple. And it's in those complicated parts, the forgotten stories, that we find the best lessons.
It reminds us that the fight for justice never ends, and we all have a part to play.
That's it. And when things get tough, remember what Rustin said. The only weapon we have is our bodies, and we need to tuck them in places so wheels don't turn. He's telling us to get out there, use our voices, our actions, our minds to make a better world, a world where everyone has a chance.
Powerful words. Or if you enjoyed this deep dive into the life of Bayard Rustin, hit that subscribe button. We'll be back with more stories like this, the ones that make you think, the ones that matter.
We're going to keep digging into history, challenge what you thought you knew, and hopefully make you see the world in a new way. Thanks for listening.